And good afternoon, good morning, everyone. My name is David Levy-Fowler, and we are in a series of webinars on injustice and redress. In Hebrew, Avlot v'tikunam. This series deals with the different kinds of injustices, historical and current, administrative and war-related, but also with the concept of the redress and how it comes to the public policy. And of course, one of the issues that are central to redress, but not exclusively solving the problem, is reparations. And today we have with us Professor Thomas Craemer, who will talk about reparations for historical atrocities. He will be able to speak both on the Holocaust and slavery in one framework. And his expert, his personal experience is someone who grew up in Germany, got his PhD in Tübingen, and then he got his political science doctorate from Tübingen, and then PhD in Stony Brook University in New York in 2005. He's one of the leading experts on reparation, bringing the issue to slavery, including an impressive study of kind of quantification of what does it mean to give reparation for slavery back then, not anymore, not in its 18th and 19th century or 18th and 19th century form. What does it mean to give reparation today? So Thomas was kindly agreed to give the talk to us, and we are very grateful for him. And I will give you the floor or the screen to start your talk. And I will ask you, I know that you mean to do that, and you intend to do that. I will ask you also to bring your personal perspective as someone who grew up in Germany, and bring it to our Israeli audience or our audience in general. So the floor is yours, Thomas.
Great. Thank you so much for the introduction. Do I have to click share or is it still on?
Yeah, no, you have to share.
Okay, sorry for that. Let me
So
just,
please share your presentation.
okay.
Here we are. It's
All
coming
right.
up and it looks good.
Good. Thank you. Thank you so much for the invitation and for the kind introduction. And it is really an honor and a very humbling experience to be able to share my thoughts on reparations and historical atrocities with an audience in Israel. This, hits very close to home. So, yeah, you mentioned that I will be talking about Holocaust reparations and also reparations for slavery in the United States. And I would like to make clear at the outset that I am not trying to compare atrocities because I don't think that's possible. I personally think that the Holocaust is unparalleled in human history, the worst historical atrocity in human memory. So, but yeah, what I want to do first is talk about my personal motivation and an introduction to the topic. And then I'll talk about two historical precedents for slavery reparations in the United States. One is Holocaust reparations, and the second is slavery reparations that were actually paid to the enslavers. So I'll talk more about that. And then I'll go through a number of slavery reparations proposals dating back to the founding of the United States and show you a quick back of the envelope method to estimate losses from US slavery and share some concluding thoughts. And I'm I'm looking forward to your comments, questions, um, or critique. Um, so let me start with my personal motivation and introduction. As you mentioned, I was born in post-World War Germany and raised in this picturesque town of Tübingen with an old university, founded in 1476. Um, yeah, it's very idyllic, but I learned in every school subject about the Holocaust, and you look very differently at your place of birth or of growing up when you know that every cobblestone carries a history about this historical atrocity. And I always wished to express to a Holocaust survivor how ashamed I felt. But of course, I never thought I would have the opportunity to. Until one day, I met Mieczysław Langer, a survivor of 5 concentration camps and a death march in his youth. And I met him because in his retirement, he relocated, of all places, to Tübingen in Germany. And I always wondered why somebody that had suffered so much at German hands would trust his old age to German hands again. So our two families got friendly with one another, and we took a spiritual journey to the place where Mieczysław was born and where he grew up in Krakow in Poland. And here this picture shows Mieczysław and his wife Felicia. And my late mother is taking the picture, and in between them is David, his grandson, a grandson he was never supposed to have. So in a way, it is his victory. Then he showed us, the family received a notice that they had to vacate their house at the Wawel, a good address. They had to move across the river into the ghetto. And one day a notice arrived that they had to assemble at this intersection in the ghetto. And he was separated from his family, never to see them again. His entire extended family was murdered by the Germans. And he was the sole survivor. He was shipped to the Płaszów concentration camp just outside of Krakow. And here he shows his grandson and us how he lived and how many died. This picture was actually taken at the Auschwitz concentration camp memorial site because at Płaszów there is no structures that are surviving. But the structures were very similar. And this to me is the most shocking image. It's Mieczysław visiting the final destinations the Nazis had in mind for him, the crematory. And yeah, it brings just to head how perverted and insane the German atrocity was. And here is a picture of David and Mieczysław at the Płaszów concentration camp memorial site. There is a very, very impressive memorial. That's the only thing on the landscape. So I was wondering, how was Mieczysław ever able to regain trust in Germans or Germany as a country after the suffering he went through as a young man? And of course, I never talked to him about it while he was still alive. And I don't want to put any words in his mouth. But what I did learn from his widow after he had passed away is that he had received a reparations pension first from the West German government and later from the United German government, starting in the 1970s when he was still living in Israel to 2015 when he unfortunately passed away. In 2022 dollars, the pension was around $2,500. That's puny for the suffering he went through. But in old age, of course, it's not nothing. I view it as a token of sincerity, a symbolic gesture, not anything that can ever make up for losses. And I don't think reparations can do that. The damage is done, the historical atrocity is committed, and it's important to use reparations as a starting point to work through the archives and through historical documents and to keep the memory alive. So reparations cannot undo the damage, but they can make words of apology more meaningful. And thus, my hope is that it can foster reconciliation in the wake of historical atrocities. But of course, that's an open question. Now, let me talk about the first precedent for reparations internationally. That's Holocaust reparations, the Luxembourg Agreement. The idea basically stemmed from reparations for, war reparations, and that had a long history. The victors of a war would demand reparations from the vanquished for the cost of the war. One example was the Versailles Treaty of 1919. And of course, this caused a lot of resentment in Germany, and some observers blame the success of the Nazi movement later on the conditions of the peace treaty. I'm not sure if that's true. On the reparations program, I doubt that that's the case, but the allies were very reluctant, the Western allies were very reluctant to demand reparations from Germany, from West Germany after World War II, because they felt that this could rekindle a reaction like the Nazi movement. And also they wished to bind West Germany into the emerging Western Bloc. So Israel approached the newly founded Israeli government approached the allies to negotiate reparations for Israel for the Holocaust, on behalf of Israel for the Holocaust, and the allies didn't do so. The Soviet Union didn't respond at all, and the United States, Great Britain, and France just brushed it off. The Allies failed to demand Holocaust reparations from West Germany on Israel's behalf. However, the first West German Chancellor, Konrad Adenauer, stated very early on in an interview in November 11th, 1949, he said, "The German people are resolved to make good the wrong done to the Jews in their name by a criminal regime, so far as this is still possible, now that millions of human beings have been destroyed beyond recall. This reparation we regard as our duty." You realize in this wording that he's already distancing the German people from the criminal regime. And it took a generation or two before Germans learned to embrace the responsibility the entire German people held for the Holocaust. So it was a lengthy process, but it's interesting that reparations started first before the culture of memory and memorialization emerged bottom up. But in Israel, of course, German reparations were strongly opposed. Here, for example, is a picture of Menachem Begin speaking up against negotiations with West Germany. Our honor shall not be sold for money. And in fact, it generated a very powerful movement against reparations negotiations with Germany. That even during the negotiations in the Knesset, windows were shattered and tear gas wafted into the chamber. But in the end, the Israeli parliament decided in favor of reparations, of negotiations with West Germany. So Elad Beck writes of the outlet Israel Hayom, Israel was on the brink of civil war. Policemen were unable to control the angry crowd. Some began throwing stones into the plenum hall. The protests were eventually quelled, but not before rioters injured several lawmakers. After 3 days of deliberations, the bill was passed with a majority of 61. 50 lawmakers voted against it. So it was not at all an easy question. And in West Germany, then Chancellor Konrad Adenauer also faced strong opposition to the payment of any reparations to Israel and the Jewish state. And it's interesting that Adenauer faced opposition from his own conservative party, the CDU, the Christian Democratic Union, while the left-leaning Social Democrats voted unanimously in favor. So in 1952, the Luxembourg Agreement was settled, and I've kind of researched some of the numbers. Whether they're accurate or not, I can't guarantee. But these are from 2007, and I expressed them in 2022 dollars. So the initial demand from Israel was to receive reparations payments to resettle 50,000 Holocaust refugees in Israel. And you see that um, this is dwarfed by what came later. And there was a portion for heirless estates, an amount to be paid to the Jewish Claims Conference to take care of survivors in the diaspora. But the lion's share was actually for survivors' pensions, and this was that Israel and the Claims Conference exerted pressure on the German government to pass national legislation for individual reparations. And those were the pensions, for example, like Meju received. And they are by far the lion's share of reparations that Germany paid. And these are actually still going on, although now the generation is passing. And we'll have to see, and this is an interesting point also to discuss what the future of reparations will be, whether future generations will be addressed or whether the program will end. So there was a portion in 1988 under pressure from the United States to pay an additional amount to Holocaust survivors. And in 1999, for the first time, reparations for slave laborers specifically were paid. This was a joint um, a joint fund paid half by the by members of the German business community and half by the government um, to acknowledge slave laborers. Of course, it came so late that barely anybody benefited from it. So that's the problem with dragging out reparations payments over long periods of time. The injustice becomes permanent. So the lion's share, as I mentioned, were the survivors' pensions. No historical atrocity in human history compares with the German Holocaust. However, Holocaust reparations have served as a precedent for addressing other historical injustices. And here's just a few examples: apartheid in South Africa, human rights violations in Chile, similar violations in Argentina, and in the United States, Japanese-American World War II internment reparations that were paid in 1988. Here's a picture of President Ronald Reagan signing the Civil Liberties Act of 1988, which provided a check of $20,000 per survivor. I think that amount was just arbitrarily made up. And it was accompanied, and I think this is very important, by a letter of apology from the US president. No such reparations have been made for slavery, but there are, as I mentioned in the beginning, there are historical precedents for reparations for slavery, but of course in the wrong direction, morally speaking. The most egregious example of reparations to the enslavers was the so-called Haitian independence debt. Haiti was the first country to permanently abolish slavery with their revolution from 1791 to 1804, in which they became independent from France. Here are pictures of Toussaint Louverture and Jean-Jacques Dessalines, two of the leaders of the Haitian Revolution. And in 1825, King Charles X of France sent a fleet to Haiti, demanding an indemnity from Haiti for the former owners that had fled to France. Of course, at that time, many of the original owners had passed away, and the French state actually went through the effort of compiling lists of descendants and heirs in a 6-volume called État détaillé, to document who was entitled to reparations. And this crippling Haitians' independent debt was financed through loans, and these loans were serviced from 1825 all the way to 1947 over a period of 122 years. So 2 years after the Holocaust ended, Haiti was still paying reparations for the abolition of slavery, for the loss of property. Similarly, in reparations to British enslavers, this program started in 1833 when the British government abolished slavery and paid 20 million pounds in reparations to the enslavers. And at that time, the British government took up loans and serviced them for 182 years, from 1833 to 2015. So just a few years ago, Great Britain got done paying off its loan for reparations for slavery. These reparations were never controversial as long as the beneficiaries were the white descendants of the enslavers rather than the black descendants of the enslaved. The same thing happened in the United States when the Lincoln administration abolished slavery in the District of Columbia, that means in the capital of Washington, in 1862. They provided $300, which was a lot of money at the time, in reparations per enslaved, but not to the enslaved themselves, but to their enslavers. The Board of Commissioners appointed to administer the act approved 930 petitions from former owners for the freedom of 2,989 former enslaved. I calculated in 2022 dollars, this would amount to $27 million at the height of the Civil War, when every penny counted for the defense of the Union. Again, not controversial as long as the recipients were white compared to the black descendants of the enslaved. And I counted about 44 countries or territories in the Caribbean, North and Latin America that paid reparations to enslavers. Here, for example, is compensated emancipation schemes in the French Caribbean. I already mentioned Haiti, but also the colonies of Guadeloupe, Martinique, and French Guyana paid reparations to the slave owners. Here's a list of Latin American colonies that became independent from Spain and paid reparations to enslavers. Often the enslaved themselves had to pay through what was called free wombs laws. Those were laws that forced the so-called freed to serve for unpaid labor until the age of 25 or 21 or whatever, when they were adult, to pay for their freedom. Other governments paid in bonds or in land, or of course, cash payments were most common. Here's a list of British colonies or territories that paid compensation to the enslavers. Oh, sorry, and then here's a Swedish colony of St. Bartholomew, the same Danish colonies of the US Virgin Islands, Dutch colonies, Suriname, Curacao, Aruba, St. Martin, and the Caribbean Netherlands, and then, of course, Brazil, the last country to abolish slavery in 1888. So now let me go through reparations proposals in the United States from the beginning of the country. The first example that I could find is actually associated with George Washington himself. It's not actually reparations, but it is for the first time an acknowledgement that you can't just liberate the enslaved after hundreds of years of exploitation without any money at all, but that you have to pay something. George Washington is pictured here with his enslaved William Billy Lee. Lee was freed by Washington's will, together with all the other enslaved that Washington held in his name. And Washington wrote in his will, "It is my will and desire that all the slaves which I hold in my own right shall receive their freedom, seeing that a regular and permanent fund be established for their support." Washington was opposed to slavery, but of course owned many slaves. This was typical for American founding fathers. Um, he hoped he could convince the enslavers to voluntarily liberate their slaves and abolish slavery in a voluntary way. And of course, this was a very naive idea and didn't happen. But his will was therefore published in the media at the time to set an example. The next example of reparations in the United States was the program called 40 Acres and a Mule, which goes back to General Sherman's Field Order number 15 during the Civil War, when he distributed confiscated Confederate land to the newly freed in 40-acre parcels. 40,000 freedmen and women received land under this program and were already working the land when Lincoln's successor, President Andrew Johnson, took the land away from the farmers that were already working on the land and returned it to the former slave owners. Sherman's Field Order number 15 inspired many land-based reparations demands. For example, Sojourner Truth in the 1870s demanded land for reparations. In the 20th century, it was Queen Mother Moore who did a lot of work for reparations for slavery in the form of land. In 1970, Dempsey Travis, an African-American economist, called for a new Homestead Act for African Americans to receive land. And most recently, in 2020, Professor William Darity and Kirsten Mullen published a book, From Here to Equality, where they revived the idea of land-based reparations. But of course, there were other proposals as well. For example, Kelly House advocated for pensions for surviving ex-slaves in the late 19th century, and she was imprisoned for her effort. Marcus Garvey in the early 20th century called for colonial reparations from Europe for depredations in Africa. James Forman in 1969 called for cash reparations from Christian and Jewish white congregations in the United States for their complicity in slavery, and he was able to collect some voluntary donations. And in 1974, economist Robert S. Brown called for a transfer of a sizable chunk of America's wealth to the Black community. And my interest here is to estimate how big that chunk might be, you know, what order of magnitude we are talking about. Then in 1988, after the Civil Liberties Act, Representative John Conyers introduced a bill, H.R. 40, which has been reintroduced in every single House of Representatives since, calling for a commission to be formed to study reparations. So the bill did not ask for a down payment, but simply to study slavery and come up with a reparations plan. And it has languished and has never seen a vote. It's still being reintroduced. And then in 2015, the hashtag GU272 captured the public's imagination, referring to the sale of 272 enslaved by Georgetown University in 1838 to save the university from financial ruin. The university promised financial reparations in 2016, but it only renamed a building for one of the enslaved, Isaac Hawkins. And thus far, not much else has happened. They're thinking very symbolic. They're not thinking about actual reparations to the descendants of the enslaved. But they did invite the descendants to the renaming ceremony. So here's a picture of that. And in September 2019, Virginia Theological Seminary passed Georgetown University and set aside $1.7 million in reparations for the enslaved that had physically built the college. And in the same year, Princeton Theological Seminary followed suit and set aside $28 million for slavery reparations. And then the city of Asheville, North Carolina, became the first city in the US to vote unanimously to approve a reparations resolution for Black residents. But actual payout has since stalled. This was in 2020. And they were surpassed by the city of Evanston, Illinois, which is the second city in the US to vote for reparations to its Black residents. And in this case, payout has actually begun. Some eligible Black households received $25,000 for housing. The problem is that the money went directly to the banks that were complicit in what was called redlining, so that's racial residential segregation, to begin with. The recipients themselves did not receive the money to make decisions how to spend it, according to their own interests. Imagine elderly people that may not want to buy a house but need money for elder care. So it was a controversial program, but at least it was actual put into reality. Then in 2020, California Governor Gavin Newsom signed Assembly Bill 3121 and established a task force to study and make recommendations on reparations for slavery in California, which is ironic because California entered the Union as a free state, but they did allow slave owners to look for gold and have their enslaved dig for gold, and the enslavers kept it. Here is a picture of Dr. Keisha Campbell and me testifying during a meeting of the California Reparations Task Force in 2022. And a report was published and is available at this website. I can make the slides available if you're interested. And here is a picture of New York Governor Hochul signing the New York State Community Commission on Reparations Remedies into law, which is the same thing in California. So several states are now working on their own reparations programs. But again, no payments have been made. So how do we wrap our minds around the order of magnitude? And here I'm estimating losses. Of whether the losses translate into reparations or not is a question that would be negotiated between the perpetrating side and the victimized side. Of course, as you saw from the numbers of Holocaust reparations, those numbers are very small and they don't address the actual loss. And of course, the actual loss is infinite because you cannot put a price on your own life or the life of a loved one. So they're always symbolic. So the question is, what order of magnitude are the losses as far as they're even estimable? So I limited my analysis to just looking at slavery in the United States from 1776, the American Revolution, to 1860. In 1865, the slavery was abolished. The last census, U.S. census that counted enslaved people was in 1860. So I don't know the exact numbers after 1860. So to stay on the conservative side, I calculated only up to 1860. And combine that with historical wage data in the free labor market. And here are the census counts every 10 years from 1790 on to 1860, the enslaved population. And I estimated the enslaved population between the decennial censuses by linear interpolation and the years from 1776 to 1790 by linear extrapolation. Of course, I've been criticized that that is very crude methodology, so a reader provided me with much more sophisticated statistical methods, but the results were essentially the same. And here's a list of production workers' hourly compensation in nominal dollars at the time. And this is on the free labor market at the time. In 1790s, workers received 2 cents on average per hour, which is puny. 1860 was 8 cents per hour. So the numbers are very small, which also keeps my calculations very conservative. So taking an interest rate of only 3%, and that's barely sufficient to make up for inflation, I arrive at a total loss amount in 2022 dollars of 20.9 trillion US dollars. And just for comparison purpose, the US GDP in the third quarter of 2022 was $25.66 trillion. So we're talking roughly 1 year worth of the US GDP as the loss, very conservatively estimated. That's a huge number. But if I use a more realistic interest rate, so I just double it to 6%, that's the interest rate that was specified in the sales contract of the Georgetown 272 slaves in 1833. That sales contract specified 6%. If I use that interest rate, the estimate goes up to $7.8 quadrillion in 2022 dollars. And of course, I don't even know what that means. But it's just, it shows you that this is it gives you an idea of the magnitude of the injustice, because this does not include colonial slavery, and it doesn't include any other form of discrimination after slavery, and it does not include loss of freedom or pain and suffering. So it is a very conservative estimate, but very large. This example shows you that the interest rate will be the most important number to determine during reparations negotiations between the African American descendants of the enslaved and the US federal government, if it should ever come to these negotiations. At this time, it looks rather unlikely. So some concluding thoughts. Reparations cannot repair the past. No amount of money can bring back a single human life. But reparations may be able to serve as a material token of sincerity, giving an apology more meaning. As an emerging international norm, they may discourage countries, leaders, or ruling elites from claiming the right of the stronger, as the Nazis did. And with that, I say thank you very much, and I am looking forward to your questions and feedback.
Thank you so much. Let me join you to the screen, at the spotlight, and now we are both on the screen. I think it was excellent presentation. I'm impressed by the breadth of historical knowledge, comparative knowledge, and also the exercise of really taking upon yourself to estimate reparation of slavery. I will start with two questions of my own before allowing the audience to come in. And the first of those two questions is, we started with the personal. Now, thinking about what's going now in the United States, where even DEI, diversity issues are being taken out, this kind of crazy backlash against historical justice. How does it feel for you? How does it affect your university, your subject, you yourself?
I think it's early days to see the effect on the university. I'm sure we are all, as academics, we're all targeted in this DEI space. I'm terrified, not for myself. I'm terrified for the United States. After World War II, my parents grew up in a generation that became very critical of the United States because of the war in Vietnam. But they always looked up to the American Revolution and to the democratic values as the example, kind of what saved us in Germany from our own grandparents. So we looked at the United States with great admiration, even if we were critical of it, of individual policies. And now I feel I'm witnessing the destruction of that very heritage that made America great as a historical example. And it seems like America wants to become just another country where ethnic superiority is claimed and everybody else is oppressed. It's the idea of the rule of the stronger that Darwinistic, social Darwinistic ideal that Trump seems to favor. And I'm terrified that on the influence on the United States, I'm hoping the pendulum will swing back. But of course, I come from a country where the pendulum did not swing back and where the pendulum kept going to the right, and we all know the outcomes. So yes, I'm very afraid for the future of the United States.
But this is reparation is even more dangerous than DEI, right?
Well, before the Trump era, I was often asked, if reparations would ever stand a chance to succeed, given the fact that affirmative action and other much smaller policies created so much backlash. And my argument was always, well, if you know that the slightest program in favor of African Americans, for example, African Americans were excluded from welfare for the longest time. The New Deal excluded African Americans from welfare benefits. When they were finally legalized in the 1950s or 60s, welfare was stereotypically associated with African Americans, which is not true. Most welfare recipients are white. But a campaign against welfare was run by the conservatives based on the stereotype that African Americans benefit. So just the idea that African Americans benefit from some, well, I mean, welfare is nothing. I mean, it's not balancing out any historical injustice, but even that created so much resentment that the backlash was against welfare overall. So the idea is, if small policies like affirmative action benefited white middle-class women with higher education the most and did almost nothing for African Americans, men and women. Busing for school integration was hugely controversial, and rocks were thrown at buses in Boston, which is a democratic city, a liberal city. Buses were thrown at buses with little school kids. But it only led to some forms of integration and then resegregation. It didn't change anything about the United States. So my idea is, if you know that the backlash will be great for small policies, just go for the big numbers. Don't start small in the negotiations. Ask for the full amount back. And that's why I was interested in estimating the full losses. I'm now working on estimates. If you take loss of freedom, loss of the ability to invest in human or financial capital, and pain and suffering into account, what would that amount based on typical values that are typical for the US economy? And of course, the numbers explode. But I think it's important to keep those numbers into mind, because the moral debt is there, and it's acknowledged even by conservatives. Mitch McConnell stated that a Republican stated that slavery was America's original sin. But he said it didn't make sense that later generations should be paying for the sins of earlier generations. My point is that if you acknowledge the sin, then the debt is open, and the debt earns interest, compound interest, and these inheritances are still being handed down from generation to generation in white hands, not in black hands. And so the injustice is going on. And if you claim that your generation can claim the positive inheritance, like the founding fathers, the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, then you also have to take ownership of the negative consequences. And I guess this is a lesson that Germany is struggling with as well. The AfD, the right-wing party, is trying to reclaim the positive in German history, and they feel it's too much overshadowed by the culture of memory of the Holocaust. And others say, no, I mean, this is part and parcel of our identity. We have to take the good with the bad, and we have to be honest about both.
Yeah, I have another question here, and it's a difficult question, and you don't have to take it. While learning again on slavery, I think slavery was disaster is a genocide, is a
Yes.
form of genocide. And slavery, the repercussion from slavery to social standing of the blacks in America or the African Americans today are still being felt.
Yes.
Like we still see the emotional, psychological damage of Holocaust survivor today. We have in Israel, we have this kind of she is second or third generation survivor, and you right or wrong, you refer to some kind of psychological misbehavior or so. So the question is, why not to compare slavery to the Holocaust? Of course, they were different, but the horrors were similar.
Yeah, this is a very difficult question, and I don't think that I'm in a position to suggest an answer, but I'm skeptical about comparing historical injustices because they are very unique and each differs. Here's a reason why I find it difficult to compare. Slavery in its cruel economic logic is based on the exploitation of slave labor, so there is an incentive for the enslaver, although to keep their enslaved as poor as possible, to keep them working and keep them alive. It's a financial incentive.
But sometimes,
Whereas in the German
but
Holocaust,
but sometimes, you know, it's better to die than to live
that's a
under.
good point as well.
Yeah.
The thing is,
I trust you. It's a problem for you to answer. Let's move to the audience. Let's keep it
can I
this
say
way.
one thing about it? I would say it differs depending on what perspective you take. Like the perspective of the perpetrator, I think the German Holocaust is unprecedented because Germany went at length to install an industry of extermination at the expense of winning the war. So it was almost an altruistic form of genocide, whereas an altruistic in a negative term here. Whereas slavery had that self-interest as a limit.
Yeah.
Of course,
Okay.
that limit was often broken, and Germany used slave labor. So from the perspective of the victimized, it doesn't make a difference. And I would agree with you that from the perspective of the victimized, it doesn't matter whether your perpetrator intends to kill you or to exploit you through slave labor and taking your death into account economically. So I would agree with you on that.
Thank you so much. I will give the floor to 3 questions and ask you to write the question and then to answer them all together. Elazar and Max and then Marcus. So Elazar, you are first.
Thank you. Thank you for giving this talk. I have a question. What is the precedent? Even if we accept that we're not comparing the violence, but the reparation for Jews was not given to replace property, to make them whole, the Wiedergutmachung, but rather humanitarian in nature, to absorb and fund the rehabilitation of refugees primarily. And then it continued with a stipend, a monthly stipend, like retirement. So where do you find precedent for the question of size and comparing which the African American demand, although that's controversial among them?
Okay.
I would suggest just one briefly. I would suggest that raising the numbers to unmanageable ones will make greater obstacles rather than would bring it back. But what would success mean if they pay $30 million to 30 million African Americans, $1 apiece? Would that be successful? Presumably not.
Mhm.
So how do we zero in on what's the scope for comparison? We can discuss it more, but let me finish here.
Thank you so much, Elazar, and Max, and then Marcus.
So first of all, thank you very much for your talk, and thank you for organizing this. I'm researching on reparations myself. I'm doing my PhD at Tel Aviv University, and Elazar, your book was the first book that I read when I prepared for my PhD. So I'm really blessed talking here to you, Mr. Craemer, and Mr. Barkan. So thank you very much. And my specific question at this moment, I have 1,000 questions to both of you, actually, but I take one. I'm researching on international reparations, and even though not a lot is going on, as you most likely know, there is this eternal, not eternal, but very long-term quest for slavery reparations on international scale from the CARICOM, and mostly from the CARICOM. Now the African Union joins in, and there is this thought to also go the long way through the institutions of the United Nations to start this new commission. And strangely, like, I know the new administration, it's a complete different topic, but even before, I wondered why the US backed this commission. The US was in favor of it, even though, like, from my perspective, it did not make sense. And I'm writing a paper on these international slavery reparations at the moment. And I wanted to ask you whether you have some insights. Maybe you talk to somebody that is involved in this process, because it just does not make sense to me that the US is backing an international commission on slavery reparations. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Max, and Marcus.
Yeah, thank you very much. That was the most interesting. I wondered if you had looked at in any way at the issue of indigenous peoples and reparations, or the way in which reparations have or have not been paid to them, specifically in the American case, where reparations almost made life worse for them rather than better. Thank you.
Thank you.
And the floor is yours again, Thomas.
All right, thank you very much for these questions. I will first turn to the first question by Elazar Barkan. Could the numbers, the high numbers, discourage reparations? And I think there is a point that the numbers may be so shocking that people will dismiss it out of hand. And as a matter of fact, I talked to members of the CARICOM Reparations Commission, Hilary Beckles, and asked him what order of magnitude they have in mind. And he took the position that they don't put a number on it precisely for that reason. And they have a list of 10 demands that are, many of them, I would say, are very symbolic or very easy to achieve for the European Union. There is resettlement in Africa, there is some health benefits, there is some mental health care, there is some, it's actually small potatoes, and the European Union could easily pay that and be done with it very cheaply. And that's a cynical view, of course. But it's stunning, and that's the same thing that I observe in the United States. If you ask for very small things, you will be rejected because the small things are considered outrageous. And that's why I said maybe you start at the top, you demand an amount that is makes more of a difference to the people, to the recipients, and then negotiate if that's possible at all. In the case of Israel demanded reparations from Germany only for the resettlement of 50,000 Holocaust survivors. And I mean, the the Adenauer administration heckled about that too, but they finally did agree to pay the demand, and in the end, the lion's share came from the Holocaust survivors' pensions, which were a result of domestic law changes. So the reparations exceeded what was initially demanded, and I think Israel could have demanded more, and I'm not sure about the future. The result for future generations was mentioned, the trauma, and so I think there is something to be said for talking about more appropriate reparations from Germany for, most of the damages, the 6 million lost, were not even addressed in the reparations program. But again, size of the demand can discourage making it a reality, but even asking for small things can discourage making it a reality. So that's why I've moved from, my first article was entitled Estimating Reparations, and I've changed that, and I'm now saying estimating losses, because losses are not equal to reparations. And it's also an understanding that only some losses can be quantified. Most losses cannot, and the most important losses cannot be quantified. But I view it as a measure of the historical injustice, just to give people an intuitive sense of the order of magnitude. So I agree that it could be an obstacle, and in the reparations community, both views are being discussed. But I think if it's made clear that the estimate is an estimate of losses, and that there is openness for negotiations, and that, in most cases only a fraction of debts are paid, but it has to be a portion of the debt that is meaningful to the recipients. And I think that's the important thing about reparations. It has to be meaningful to the recipients in order for there to be a sense of, I don't know, I mean, I don't want to call it reconciliation, but if I look at the historical experience of Germany and Israel, who are today friendly nations, and that would have been impossible to imagine at the end of World War II and the Holocaust. I guess the bottom line is it has to be meaningful to the recipients, and that is often overlooked when the perpetrators get to decide what the proper amount should be. I'm not sure if that addresses the amount, but you see I'm internally conflicted about that myself. Now let me address Max Goetz's question on it addressed the CARICOM and the African Union, and the question why the United States government would back a commission. And I have a very, very cynical answer for that. And I'm not sure if I'm right. But my feeling is that American politicians are caught, and especially liberal politicians are caught between a rock and a hard place. They need to appeal to their African American electorate, and they need to signal. And they know the African American electorate demands reparations. So what better to do than to demand a commission that does not include a down payment on reparations, but to just study it. So California and New York are examples. Here reparations commissions are founded, they're unfunded, there's no money changing hands, and there probably never will, but the politicians can claim that they care. And I think that's also why a liberal government would support a UN commission, because it's not dangerous to have a commission. But I do see an advantage of commissions. They dig into the archives and they look at the numbers, and they do what was not done in the German-Israeli case, which came later, 2 generations later, when a bottom-up process of memory kicked in, where local schools and local people started digging in urban archives to find which properties had Jewish owners and were taken away through Aryanization, and to figure out the history. And now there is this process of stumbling blocks or stumbling stones where bronze cobblestones are inserted in the pavement in German cities, inscribed with the Jewish owners or residents of buildings. And that's a local initiative where people research the archives and commemorate people. I think that's the function of commissions, to dig into archives and to start a process of accounting historically. So I think it's good. Now to address the question of Marcus Hall's side on indigenous reparations, I'm absolutely in favor of that too. I think reparations should become an international norm to address injustices, just to discourage the right of the stronger that's often claimed in international affairs, that the stronger has to anticipate that the stronger or their legal successors will be called to account. And with Native American reparations, it's a long and arduous history. There was a reparations commission formed after World War II as a sign of gratitude to the Native American tribes that had participated in World War II. And that commission started working on reparations for land theft from the beginning of the United States till today. But it resulted in barely any payments. A few $1 million passed hands. I'm not entirely sure about the amounts, but the Native American interest group basically claimed that these were, they were meaningless. And that's again important, that reparations amounts, regardless of how they are arrived at, whether through estimating losses or through just coming up with a number, they have to be meaningful to the recipients. And in the case of Native American reparations, they obviously weren't. But it's an important point. Yeah, I agree. I hope I addressed some of the questions. I'm free, feel free to follow up if I didn't.
Thank you so much, Thomas. I think people will want to hear more from you, and I hope they can write to you directly.
Absolutely. Should I put my email in the chat?
Yes, this is one form. You are all also invited to visit our website and our YouTube channel. And we hope to see you in our next webinar with Professor Shalva Weil on femicide a week from now. Thank you so much, Thomas. It was excellent talk on exciting and important topic. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me, and thank you for your questions. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.